Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so we'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion, which is about this little project called 5G, and more importantly, the future of 5G. So really appreciate the ongoing interest that is being shown by certainly the stakeholders in the aviation and telco communities, and we have a really great panel of experts to talk today. A little bit of reflection, but more importantly about some of the current and future activities associated with 5G C-band. I'm Dee Reimold, VP for Civil Aviation at the Aerospace Industries Association, and I'm joined by some very important colleagues and more importantly friends for this discussion. So let me go ahead and ask the panel to introduce themselves, a little bit about their roles, and then we'll get started with our conversation. So Sharon, over to you.
Thanks, Dee, and thanks for including Airlines for America in today's discussion. My name is Sharon Pinkerton. I'm the Senior Vice President of Legislative and Regulatory Policy for Airlines for America. I have been working this issue along with Dean and Hank and others since, I guess, 2019. So it's been a while.
Thank you very much. Hank?
Sure. Thanks, Dee. Hank Holquist. I'm the Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs for AT&T. I've been in the telecom industry. It'll be 30 years in a year from now, so 29 years. I've worked on spectrum issues for over a decade, and Dee and I became very close friends during the implementation of and deployment of the first round of C-band in 2021, and really worked together very closely while Dee was at the FAA at that time to solve the problems that arose with respect to that deployment. And so, a lot of experience working on this and a lot of sort of, institutional knowledge at this point.
And last but certainly not least, my colleague Tim.
Thanks, Dee. So Tim White, Vice President for Engineering and Technology here at AIA. My role is primarily on the technical side, working with our technical representatives to understand the challenge at hand, how do we address it, and how do we engage with our friends over on the telecom side.
Well, and again, a special thanks to each of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to have this conversation. It's clearly very important. It's for the audience to be aware. At least once a month, about 50 of us get together. People from across the aviation spectrum and across the telecommunications spectrum to continue the technical and policy conversations that are a result of the current implementation of 5G C-band in the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz range, as well as future reallocations that are being considered. And we're going to be talking about those today and why that's so important to the work that we have going on to define a long-term solution for coexistence. Certainly, Sharon mentioned, from the air carriers at the end of the day, they are the ones that are being advised by the FAA whether or not it is safe for them to conduct their operations. And when it's not safe to conduct, that impacts, the flying public, that impacts cargo, that impacts everything. And similarly, with Hank and I spent many hours along with others talking about was the impact to the telco carriers when they cannot deploy their networks. And look, any one of us on a plane is constantly checking our phones too. So we have a very unique symbiotic relationship, I think, which is, I think, at the heart of the coexistence that we're striving for long term. So maybe to get the conversation going, I think it is important to spend just a few minutes in some reflection. I think it's just a little bit more than 2 years ago, July 1st, 2023, was kind of a pivotal date for many of us that were working in the initial 5G C-band implementation. And that was the date that the telcos were going to power up their networks. For about 2 years prior to that, we had been working literally day and night to do, uh, a technical analysis, operational analysis of where the telcos, and in this case it was AT&T and Verizon, where they wanted to deploy their antennas, and the painstaking process of trying to evaluate would that impact flight operations, would that impact safety around airports. And I think it's when I think back on it, it's just an amazing amount of work done by so many incredibly talented and smart people. But from all of that, and the fact is, July 1st, 2023 came and went. Planes didn't fall out of the sky. Uh, Telco towers didn't burn up. I mean, it was all good. It was just another day. Um, I think we all learned a lot of very, very important lessons. And I kind of want to spend some time with this panel because, we were all through the baptism by fire. And Sharon, I'm going to turn to you first, if I could, and maybe just give some idea of some of those important lessons that you took away from all of that experience.
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, as you said, things went smoothly on July the 1st, 2023. But frankly, that was a result of 2 years at least of really hard, painful work. And so, in terms of lessons learned, I mean, listen, I think that the aviation folks on this webinar know in aviation, we are resilient and we are able to get things done. And I think ultimately we did get things done, but probably not in the most efficient way possible. So I think there was pain on the telco side, and there was certainly pain on the aviation side, as we came up to deadlines and contemplated the potential um, for um, for potential disruption in the aviation system. So looking back, I think there are several lessons learned, but I'm happy to say, I think one of the main lessons learned is that what will benefit us both, and when I say us both, I mean the aviation sector and the telecommunications sector, is to have certainty going into auctions and auction implementation. Certainty about what the safety issues are and what the implementation issues are and what the timelines are. And I'm happy to report that as a result of all sides having learned that lesson, that certainty and an agreed upon plan is what's going to be valuable to us both. I think that we have spent the years since the implementation on the lower band. And now, and I know Tim's going to talk about it later with the One Big Beautiful Bill's requirement to auction off another part of the upper band. We have this common goal of trying to reach an agreement on a framework, frankly, of what would enable us to safely coexist, and something that we could agree upon, obviously before the auction, so that both sides could have certainty. The telcos could have certainty about where they're going to put, their resources, at what power, at what angle, and for us, what the requirements are going to be in terms of retrofitting our aircraft again. So I would say that's been a critical lesson that we've all learned and have come out of it, both valuing the same thing, wanting certainty about the future. And then certainly, I think from our perspective, we all know in the aviation sector, safety is our top priority. And as users of the system, I'm speaking for the airlines right now, we don't set the safety standard. We follow what our safety regulator, the FAA, tells us will be the safe standard. And so I think that's another, hopefully, I know there was a lot of, frankly, different views on what was safe and what wasn't. At the end of the day, airlines don't make that determination. The FAA makes the determination about what's safe. And I think that they are in the process of, again, I'm happy to report, Dee mentioned these monthly meetings, they're in all of those. So we're all working together and communicating. But I think that we all have the goal of ensuring that the system will continue to be safe. And I don't think it's lost on anyone, this tragedy at DCA that happened in January has been a very, very sad reminder to us all of how important safety is. Even things like, we're hearing a lot of discussion for those of you that listen to the NTSB hearings about the helicopter radio altimeters. And so I think that there is a joint respect of the FAA's role here, but at the same time, a real commitment on our part to say, we want our country to lead in the telecommunications space. We want to be leaders in technology, and we firmly believe there is an opportunity for us to work together and safely coexist and enable innovation to move forward. So that's kind of the big picture for me, Dee.
No, Sharon, that's great and very well said. Hank, let me turn to you and kind of get some reflections from you on some of those valuable lessons we learned.
Yeah, gosh, there were so many. But I guess the first one I'll mention is to kind of reiterate a point Sharon just made, which is that one thing we really learned through this process was there's not a lot of benefit and value in arguing about whether something is or is not safe. We had many early days discussions about whether the FAA's margins were excessive, and ultimately I think what we learned was to make progress we had to set those issues aside and understand what the FAA needed in order to reach the conclusion that the conditions were safe. And so kind of put aside our own views about that and just recognize that ultimately the FAA would make a determination about what was safe for the airspace. And that determination would then be what would determine, the operations of aircraft, helicopters, everything. And so I think that was really a key thing, because once we did that, once we stopped, trying to figure out what was safe or not and just left it to the FAA, then we were able to say, okay, what are the steps we need to take to make progress ultimately toward that date that you mentioned of July 2023. That was kind of the final step in a series of steps that were taken sequentially to enable expanded use of the spectrum that we had previously bought at auction. And I think that also feeds into one of Sharon's points, which is what happened in the initial, what I guess now we call the lower C-band, happened in a context where the telecom industry did not, in its mind, have any reason to think that there would be any barriers to our deployment of the spectrum associated with radio altimeters. We had absolutely no reason, or maybe that if we had thought harder, we might have found a reason, but we did not believe that there was any reason to worry about that. So, the FCC held an auction that, raised, I think ultimately around $80 billion. I mean, AT&T alone spent $25 billion. And so in those circumstances, we had to find a solution. We could not have been in a position where we, in effect, could not use the asset that we had spent so much money on. I think that gets to another point Sharon made, which is really a lesson learned this time, is that we will want to know with certainty going into any auction of spectrum that we now call upper C-band, that that spectrum will be available to be used on a known timeline without concerns about the FAA taking actions that would disrupt aviation, because I think that's not something we want to be associated with. So if we're able to do that, then I think we can have a successful auction. If we're not able to have knowledge about a timeline and that the spectrum can be deployed without disrupting aviation operations because of actions the FAA might take, then we won't have a successful auction. And so, because we're not, like I said, last time we didn't know this could be a problem. Now we know. And so a successful auction will depend on having that information and that knowledge. So I would say those are two really important lessons that we learned, that I think will. I guess the last one I'll mention is, I think, well, no, it's not really associated. I won't go into that. I would just say the other lesson we learned is one I've always believed, that if you get people together who, act in good faith to try to solve a problem, you most of the time can find a solution. And that's what we did. So with that, I'll stop.
All right, Hank, thank you. Again, I think I'm not going to put Tim on the spot, although he and I have had a lot of conversations, but I am going to turn to Tim in a moment. Let me just maybe, I can't add much to what Hank and Sharon have said. I think there are so many lessons learned. I think, certainly, I think, Sharon, you talked about, the U.S. leadership and how important it is. And I think that was a reflection that came through from both industries. There was a mutual recognition that, that both industries are vital to U.S. interests. And so it was in our collective best interest to figure it out, right? And Hank mentioned progress, and I can remember there was a mantra. It was progress no matter how small. I mean, some days it was just incremental, and that just kind of became a way of doing. We would figure out technical challenges, and it could have been 3 days of just nonstop analysis just to get a simple yes maybe on one small issue, but it was progress nonetheless, and that became a way of thinking and doing. So I think all of those lessons learned are with us as we were talking through what Hank has referred to, and Sharon, as the upper C-band. And Tim, I'm going to ask you to kind of step in now. I think for people that are part of these daily discussions, we kind of flip through either using numbers or designations like up or lower or whatever. But maybe explain, with this recent One Big Beautiful Bill and the new direction for potential more reallocation, why that's really put additional onus on us to figure out a long-term coexistence.
Yeah, great question. And probably one of the most salient questions that people ask is, but why is this a problem? And I think to understand that, you look at spectrum. Spectrum is just energy. And like a sound, if you think about a bass sound being very low frequency and a high sound being very high frequency, so a bass drum and a piccolo. What essentially we're doing here is we're saying we want to be able to have our radio altimeters operate at this frequency, and we'd like cell phones to be very, very close in frequency as well. And essentially what we're trying to do here is say, how do we make that possible? How do I make sure that the cell phones are listening to the cell phone frequencies and the radio altimeters are listening to the radio altimeter frequencies, no matter how close they get? In the prior activity, the one that happened, and frankly, I'm Johnny come lately, right? I wasn't here for the last one. So I'm an interested participant, but really pleased to be part of this one. In the last one, they were a little bit further apart, and that enabled the technical solution to be a filter. Now, because the one big beautiful bill stipulates that at least 100 megahertz are going to be right up next to that radio altimeter frequency, we need to do something more. So that creates a greater technical requirement. That means that probably we are going to be replacing not just adding filters, but actually adding and changing the radar altimeters themselves. That's a very different technical problem than what happened in the last one. And that's part of the reason why we have been getting together so frequently for so long, because my observation is that just as Hank said, and I thought it was so spot on, you get the people in the room and then they figure it out. And that's largely what we've been doing. Is it's been really interesting to watch as the two sides keep coming closer and closer together as we understand, here's what your needs are, here's what my needs are. How do we coexist in a way that recognizes that we have different incentives, different requirements, and yet we each have a responsibility to our constituency that we're looking to deliver. And so as we think about the technical solution from the aviation side, our intent is to go and develop new capabilities that are as robust as they can possibly be to whatever signals come our way, regardless of whether they're below us, ahead of us, how loud, how close can they be? How much can we tolerate based on physics? Those are the questions that we've been asking ourselves.
No, that's super helpful, Tim. And I think for those listening to our discussion today, I think it's worth reminding everyone. Tim mentioned the retrofits that were done to the radio altimeters to accommodate the 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz C-band operations. There were over 7,000 aircraft, 7,000 domestic aircraft alone that were retrofit. Each one of those aircraft required on the order of 2.5 radio altimeter retrofit. So it's a little inexact. We use 2.5 as a general estimate. Some aircraft, smaller aircraft have one. Larger aircraft can have three. So, there's a real mix in the fleet. Probably an equal number of international aircraft had to be retrofit. So when we talked about July 1st, 2023 coming and going, it wasn't luck in the universe. It was after a lot of work had been done by both industries. Certainly the airlines having to have planes taken out of service for the retrofits to be done, and all the schedule maneuvering that had to happen to make that occur. And then similarly for Verizon and AT&T, it was reduced operations, reduced number of sites, just in order to make sure that the entire ecosystem between aviation and telecommunications could continue to operate, albeit in a mitigated fashion. And I think what Tim just raises now, if you look at that context, I'm going to say it, and Sharon will kick me virtually under the table, that retrofits were easy compared to replacing avionics into aircraft. It's a much more complicated effort, certainly in terms of the time it will take, and the verification that the replacements are safe and functional, and cost. So I mean, we have a lot in front of us as we contemplate what this looks like. But in order to get to that point, we need new performance standards. for new radio altimeters. And I would say certainly this is something that a group of industry experts in conjunction with some of the U.S. government have been working to define what those new standards need to consider and what they need to look like. Tim, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, certainly something you and I have talked. It's been these new performance standards have been in development for many, many years. What's taking so long?
Yeah. No, very valid question, and one that we get all the time. So, for context, I think it's relevant to note that the standard that we're operating on now, not the new and updated one, has been around for around 50 years. It's a very old standard. And the environment that that standard addressed, the radio frequency environment, was very, very different. Much quieter, much more distance between the radio altimeters that we're using and any other signals. And so it allowed those radio altimeters some leeway in the way that they operated. We now are looking at a new standard. We've been developing a standard for some time, and the intent of that standard is to be good for another 50 years. In order to do that, we are looking at it from a physics-based approach, a first principles approach. What that means is that we're taking really down to the very bones of how do these things work? How should they work? What is the maximum opportunity that we have to squeeze out every last bit of performance out of the spectrum that we do have, while at the same time rejecting those signals that are outside the bands that we're using? So in order to do that, and the word that I love that Sharon used was certainty. Our intent is not to develop a standard, set it out there, and see whether or not people can make it. Our intent is to know that when the standard is released, that it is absolutely representative of what can happen. So in order to get there, you're not just writing a standard for the sake of go see, you're writing a standard and saying, do we know that it will work? Can we test for it? Have we validated the fact that this can in fact reject noise and it can be discerning of all of those different features that we might fly over? So it is very much a next generation spec, and the expectation is that it doesn't just apply to large commercial aircraft, but it goes to the smaller aircraft as well. And what about rotary wing? And like all of these different considerations, we are looking at very much the release of a single standard that really encompasses what we think the environment could look like in 50 years. In order to do that, we're being fairly exhaustive in what we look at, how we write it, how we validate it, how we approach external industries, external stakeholders. It's a long process, and we acknowledge that, but we really are very focused on being right at the end.
Well, I think what you've been able to encapsulate is, I mean, what's I think certainly obvious to everyone, the aviation world and its changes operates at a completely different pace than telco does. The new generation of telco services that we come to expect on a regular basis. It's and that's, you know, kind of going back to some of the lessons learned that Sharon and Hank mentioned. You know, we had to understand that these two industries do operate on different time frames, and they operate in different risk environments. You know, we can say the same word in our discussions and mean two completely different things, right? So, you know, all of that is a challenge. Hank, I want to come back to you now with Tim kind of laying out, you know, this idea that you know, we're trying to get a multi-decade product identified, what that needs to look like and what it needs to consider. Can you spend a little bit of time talking to us? You know, we've got the spending bill required that the FCC conduct an auction within 2 years of the signing. So that puts it somewhere in July of 2027. I think for the folks on this call, it would be maybe helpful to understand what that typical auction prep and auction process looks like.
Sure, thanks, Dee. So, as you said, that basically the statute requires the FCC to complete an auction within 2 years, which, if they actually meet that, would be by July 4th of 2027. So what's going to happen? Well, the FCC already kind of started a process to look at the upper C-band before the bill passed. They had adopted what they call an NOI, Notice of Inquiry, that they released earlier this year. And there were comments and reply comments filed in that proceeding, including from many in the aviation community, as well as what I think of as the usual suspects in telecom. And so that's kind of the first step. Basically, a notice of inquiry is the agency wants to get more information about a subject. They haven't reached any conclusions yet, or even tentative conclusions about how they should deal with the subject. So they're really asking for pretty wide-ranging input on some fairly high-level questions. The next step in the process will be, we would expect that sometime before the end of the year, the FCC will adopt a notice of proposed rulemaking. This is kind of a closer to actually getting rules than the NOI. The FCC will ask more specific questions about a variety of issues regarding the potential reallocation of the upper C-band or a portion of the upper C-band. There are a lot of issues that will have to be resolved, not just on the aviation side, but also on, today that spectrum is used for fixed satellite service. And so there'll be a lot of questions about transitioning the users of that service or compressing that service. So it'll be a fairly complicated NPRM, lots of questions. It'll probably have a lot of similarities to the NPRM that they adopted in the lower C-band proceeding. So there'll be comments and reply comments filed on that. Like I said, we would expect the NPRM sometime later this year. So by sometime next year, the whole proceeding will be complete, and they will go to the next step in their process, which I would expect sometime in 2026. Hard to give a date when, so I'll just say sometime before the end of 2026. They will likely adopt an order that will adopt specific rules about an auction of the upper C-band, including, importantly for this purposes, I would anticipate it would include rules about when the auction will be held, what the clearing process will be to clear the existing users of the band, how long that will take. And also, I think they'll have to address when the radio altimeter issues will be resolved by, what kinds of payments will be made both on the satellite side and on the radio altimeter side to facilitate the transition. And so it'll be a fairly robust order with really, it's going to have almost all the details that we'll need to get ready for an auction. It won't be the final step because the FCC before the auction also will adopt a couple of other public notices related to the technical questions of the auction, related to what just their whole auction process. There are certain forms that have to be filed prior to the auction. So I think all those steps will take place, ultimately leading up to what I would expect would be an auction that will begin sometime in the second quarter of 2027. Auctions, it's hard to predict how long an auction will last, but I would expect they'll give themselves at least 60 days clear of that July date. So I would expect they'll want to start the auction by early May of 2027. And so that's kind of a rough guess at how this timeline is likely to play out. There certainly could be variances depending on what comes into the record, how the interagency process works. There's going to be a lot of interagency activity here with NTIA, the FAA, the Department of Transportation, the FCC. So hard. I don't have a lot of, no, if you're not on the inside of the government, you don't have a lot of visibility into that process, but that process is going to be taking place too. So there's a lot of steps. This is a pretty aggressive timeline. I can tell you, I certainly would feel better about this if they had another year to get this done. 3 years would seem good to me, but they will. I have every confidence that they will get it done in 2.
So can I put you on the spot? So we get to the potentially an auction in 2 years. You want to even hazard a guess for when the spectrum would be accessed? Is
So
there
I
kind
think
of a
there's a
typical
lot of
timeline,
unknowns.
maybe?
There's a lot of unknowns there, Dee.
Yeah.
The first question is, like when we started talking about the upper C-band, I want to say, I don't know, a year and a half ago, the biggest question in our mind on the telecom side was, will they clear all of it? Will they just clear the satellite users out of the band, or will they retain satellite usage in a part of the band? That's what they did the first time. They basically retained satellite usage in 200 megahertz, and there's a 20 megahertz guard band. So you've got 280 megahertz. It was originally 500. So that was kind of the biggest question. Are they going to clear them out? At this point, I think it's unlikely that they're going to clear the satellite users entirely from the band. So a portion of the band is going to continue to be used for satellite usage. Unclear how much, and that'll be worked out through the process. But what that means is that the satellite industry is going to have to go through a process of installing new filters on their Earth stations, because their Earth stations will have to be basically constrained to whatever portion of the band remains satellite, and they'll want to be able to filter out the terrestrial wireless signals that would be in frequencies that they currently receive. So there's going to have to be a process for that. It is likely that some of the satellite users will move on to different transport technologies, which could be a different satellite band or could be fiber. So there's going to have to be time for all that to happen. How much time? That'll come out through the process. What we do know is in the lower C-band had 2 clearing steps. The first step was 12 months, and that step was that 100 megahertz of the total 280, only the bottom 100 megahertz, so from 3.7 to 3.8, was made available, and was only made available in 46 markets. So there was really like this initial deployment of 100 megahertz, which the way the rules worked was that the auction actually you had to bid on separate products to get that early clearing. So that was all Verizon and AT&T. That's why the first go round, this was all Verizon and AT&T, because we were the only entities that were authorized in that first 100 megahertz in the 46 markets. But the rest of the spectrum, that is all the other markets and all 280 megahertz, that was a 3-year clearing process. Ultimately, it got done a little faster. I think you probably remember, Dee, that we were cleared, I think, by August or September of
I remember it very
2015.
well. I was in the car driving and I almost drove off the road.
And it had until December, but I want to be clear. I think we had let you guys know ahead of time.
100%. Yeah. It was a good news, bad news call. I remember it very fondly. No, but no business, no. But I think what you're also helping us understand is that, incentives will get entities to do things much more rapidly than they would normally have done.
That's right, because there were incentives for the satellite companies to clear early. Right. And in addition to the kind of the formal incentives that were part of the order itself and associated with the auction, there were some side deals that were made to make this happen. So all of this is to say, I know that the spectrum is not going to be available, even just looking at the satellite side immediately. There's going to be some amount of time between the time of the auction and when the winners of the auction will expect to get access. I also expect that this time the date of access is also going to be tied to a schedule for the retrofits of the altimeters that you and Tim were talking about earlier. So I think there's going to have to be developed a schedule through the FAA ultimately that says, okay, here's when these retrofits will be completed by, which could also include incentive payments from the auction winners to accelerate that timeline. But that timeline has to exist. This is what I was saying earlier. We're not going to go in. Nobody's going to go into this auction and say, "Yeah, I'm going to spend $10 billion or whatever the number is," even though I don't know at the end of the auction
Right.
when this can actually be used, and I don't know if the FAA is going to restrict the aviation operations or not. Nobody's going to do that. The bidders this time will know going in that the only way they'll be willing to commit those kind of funds to the auction is if they know when they can actually get access to the spectrum, which will be dependent both on the satellite clearing and, I believe, on the retrofits of the aviation equipment.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Hank. It's been great for, I think, the audience to hear from you, your perspective, which is obviously one of 30 years of experience. So, understanding from you how you see things roll out is helpful for our understanding since we're not as close to this as you are. But there are two things that I wanted to know too, as you would walked through the timing of the auction process again. Appreciate you calling out, the extra time it's potentially going to take. Well, it will take to clear the satellite. But you had said you thought by basically the summer of 2027 that the auction could start. Just to remind our audience, as we look at this timeline, there's a critical part of the timeline that right now isn't scheduled to even be completed until March of 2027. And that is what Tim was talking about, coming up with this new 50-year robust new standard for new radio altimeters. So we won't, unfortunately, have a standard until 2027 of the spring of 2027, which means all the things can't, can't start or can't start in earnest. The design of the new equipment, the FAA has to certify the new equipment. We know how FAA is doing on certification these days. That takes time. Then the product has to be manufactured, etc. And then it gets to the airlines to deal with our supply chain and everything else to determine, how quickly we can buy that equipment and put it on. So I think therein lies a real challenge for us. We're all committed to figuring out this timeline and doing it in a way that's as aggressive yet safe as possible. But I did want to note that we're up against real challenges with respect to that timeline. I wanted to say one other thing too, because I do think something that's different. There's a couple of things that are different. Another thing that's outstanding that I think is a contingency that's going to impact this timeline. We don't know yet whether this new standard is going to require us just to replace the transceiver or also the antenna. And if we're required to replace the antenna, that's going to take an additional amount of time. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to note was I do think what's different this time is, frankly, I think there was a disconnect within the administration. Obviously, we remember the kind of the finger pointing that went on, with the FCC saying they hadn't they were surprised by these safety issues, et cetera. We know now that our new administrator of the FAA has in fact talked to the chair of the FCC. We know that the FAA's technical folks have been asked for data from the FCC. So I am encouraged by that our regulators and the folks that are in charge of the auction have a better foundation upon which to work toward a mutually acceptable goal.
No, it was so well said, Sharon. I want to continue to pull the thread. I was going to ask you because you've been such a leading voice in our joint industry discussions on the rulemaking that the FAA has to undertake. It's not just on the FCC side. I mean, again, whether you call it, the point that you made early on in our conversation was that you all don't decide when it's safe to fly. Your members, your airlines are advised by the FAA about the conditions in the National Airspace System or in other air traffic systems around the world. But can you talk to the audience just a little bit about, that kind of rulemaking that we've been urging the FAA to get going sooner rather than later, that demand signal?
Yeah, well, like I said, the good news is that the FAA has been part of every one of these discussions in the last year and a half. And while I don't think they're necessarily the rulemaking people that have been involved, I do think those folks that have been involved, I do know the rulemaking folks, they've certainly already reached out to me. So they're aware and the deputy administrator and the general counsel, I think, are also keenly aware
Yeah.
that they're going to have to do this rulemaking. So they're already starting to plan for that. I don't think that means it's going to be easy or I've never seen a rulemaking necessarily go quickly at the FAA, but I do think that they're already being informed. They know there's pressure on the schedule. And so I think they'll be as well prepared as one could possibly hope. As you know, Dee, I had brought up and we had discussed, would an aviation rulemaking
Making committee, yeah.
committee in this instance help facilitate an FAA rulemaking? Frankly, I'm now that I'm kind of seeing, I think, really great progress in the technical meetings that we've been having. It's my view that I believe we are going to reach an agreement with the telecommunications industry. I think we're going to get there. And I think the power of that is what is of an agreement, an agreed upon, and I'm
A
just
way
making this
forward, yeah.
up, but, telcos potentially agree to X mitigations and we agree to X schedule. And, incentives are involved, as Hank said, to accelerate the design, builds, and retrofit. If we can come to the FAA and the FCC and say, these two industries have agreed that this is the way forward. I think there's real power in that, and I think it will facilitate an expeditious rulemaking.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Thank you. Tim, let me just I'm kind of watching the clock here. It goes by so quickly when we're talking about 5G. But Tim, you mentioned when we were chatting earlier this week just about, looking at the kind of the super context, and you had that advantage of coming into it and certainly understanding the issues, but not having all the war stories about, again, what our common vocabulary needs to be about, assessing this in terms of risk, right? And risk, whether it's risk management, risk avoidance, risk absorption. Can you just maybe share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Dee, I think that that is probably the topic du jour. And the reason that I say that is that I think that we have now got a really good understanding about the process that we need to undertake, both sides, right? Both from the telecom as well as from the aviation side. We need to set standards. We need to get concurrence from the regulator. We need to start designing. We need to get certification on the boxes. We need to manufacture. We need to install. And the same thing similarly needs to happen on the telecom side. The issue that we run into is that you can look at each one of those activities and say, well, it's going to take 2 years, ostensibly, for whatever it is. But is it 2 years at 95% confidence? Is it 2 years at 10% confidence? And understanding what are the items that are of most risk? Is it the supply chain? Is it, in fact, certification? Is it personnel availability? Is it rare earths? Really diving down and saying, what are the potential problems that we might come across? And now, what are the mitigations that we will put in place right now to ensure that we will hit those dates? I think that that is where the conversation is really going to get to.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So I think I really am just so always honored to listen to you all. Just such a wealth of knowledge, and we've talked about so many things. Risk, of course, and Sharon, talking about the challenges, but again, this very positive, we figured this out before. We'll figure it out again and get an alignment on the timeline that Hank alluded to, so that the telcos, when they are paying these massive amounts to utilize the spectrum, they know exactly what they're getting. So I think, obviously a lot of work ahead. We talked a little bit about the satellite providers. I mean, again, at some point, they need to be part of our industry discussions. I think, the transparency and the collaboration that aviation and telco have developed needs to be expanded to include the other users of the system, not just for this upcoming auction, which, by the way, the language says at least 100 megahertz. It's still a little unclear about how much that really will be. We can all speculate on that, but again, I think that our conversations, as we've noted repeatedly in this discussion, will help inform the FCC about the art of the possible. So with that, I think I wanted to just maybe a few closing thoughts. As I said, we are engaging regularly. There are people that have been working on some of the technical issues for at least 5 years now, and it's a relatively small community of the true RF engineering experts that get all of this, but they'll continue to work. Sharon, I think also, as you and many others of us in the coalition for the air traffic modernization here in the U.S., I mean, this is a beta case, right? For how do we get rulemaking that is efficient but safe? How do we get certification activities that are efficient and safe? But I think we have an opportunity to kind of leverage this, because it is going to become, what we should be doing on a normal basis to continue to modernize, whether we're modernizing the infrastructure, whether we're modernizing aircraft. So I think all of this will continue to give us the lessons learned that are so critical. So before we conclude, any final thoughts from the panelists to share with our audience today?
No, just to say thanks, Dee, for bringing us together. I think this has been a great recap of kind of what we've been through and how we're approaching this moving forward. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I think it's going to be a challenge to get the agreement that I mentioned, but I do honestly believe that we're on a good path to getting there. It's an imperative that we do it both for our industry and telcos. And with respect to the FAA, I will just say this. I personally, having been through this the last time around, again, want to just say I think between the department and Liam and Chris, and I know Brian Bedford, having talked to Chairman Carr, I think that they're on it. And so I think the team is well positioned to drive this to the finish.
Great.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, Dee. Just really thank you. I appreciate the dialogue as always. I think the more we talk, the more we're sort of able to put ourselves in each other's shoes and get a better appreciation of everybody's perspective on the challenges that we're trying to fix. And that's really, to me, always the key to actually meeting the challenge.
Thanks, Hank. Tim?
Yeah, one last thing is my observation on the level of collaboration has been one of the most impressive examples of how to work things out together with competing interests that I've seen throughout my career. I share the concerns that Sharon raised. I share the optimism as well. And in part, I share the optimism because of the people that we've been able to put in the room. They are smart, they are balanced, they really represent national asset level folks that we're bringing together from both sides and have really hard hitting, very pointed, very respectful conversations. And so, because of that, I really have a lot of confidence in the path forward and the opportunities that we have together.
Well said. Thank you. For our audience, thank you again for being with us this afternoon. We will plan another webinar as we continue to make progress in the months ahead and bring you all up to date. So with that, have a great afternoon and thank you for your time. Bye-bye.